The Volkai arrived at cadet orientation on the first morning, and the sound they made was not a threat exactly. It was more like the sound a threat makes when it has already decided the outcome and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. 6 of them, each standing 2.5 meters tall, their dorsal spines fanned open in what the orientation briefing had called a standard threat display, which was the Galactic Coalition's polite way of saying these creatures were designed by evolution to make other creatures stand very still and then die. Their hides were layered in overlapping plates of dense chitin the color of dried blood, and their forward-facing compound eyes rotated slowly in their sockets the way security cameras do, not looking for something in particular, just making sure everything in the room was properly cataloged and assigned a threat level. Private First Class Calyx, Marin assigned himself a threat level of approximately, very much here by mistake, and went back to eating his reconstituted protein bar. He was sitting at the far end of the cadet mess hall on way station KL9, which was the Galactic Coalition's forward training installation in the outer reach. A cluster of prefabricated habitat rings bolted to an old ore processing platform that smelled permanently of recycled coolant and alien ambition. There were 412 cadets from 37 different species enrolled in the Coalition's combined arms training program. Calyx was one of 3 humans. He was also the only one eating a protein bar for breakfast, which told you something about the state of the human food supply allocation on KL9. The Volkai did not eat protein bars. The Volkai did not eat anything that had ever been reconstituted. They ate what they killed, and what they killed tended to be large. Calyx watched them move between the food dispensers with the kind of patient appreciation he usually reserved for natural disasters and particularly complicated math problems. They were magnificent in a way that bypassed aesthetic judgment and went straight to the older parts of the brain, the parts that said, "Do not stand between this thing and whatever it is looking at." One of them knocked over a table with its elbow, not noticing, or perhaps noticing, and simply classifying the table as a problem that had already resolved itself. Another reached across a Sarathi cadet to take the last of the synthetic meat portions. The Sarathi, who was herself 6 feet tall with retractable bone spurs along her forearms, shifted her tray 3 inches to the left and said nothing. Calyx finished his protein bar and wrote the date on the wrapper with a pen he kept in his breast pocket. Old habit. His father had been a surveyor in the Belt Territories, and surveyors marked their consumables. It was the kind of small ritual that got passed down without anyone intending it. He tucked the pen back into his pocket. He had been on KL9 for 11 days, and in that time he had discovered 3 things about himself that he had not known before. First, he was apparently faster than he looked, which was something the Terathi sparring instructor had pointed out with what seemed like genuine surprise. Second, he had an unusually high threshold for being insulted, which was useful since approximately 60% of the alien cadets considered humans to be a novelty rather than a peer, and the remaining 40% were trying to be polite about it and not entirely succeeding. Third, he had a very specific and deeply personal problem with the Volkai. It was not that they were dangerous. Everything in the outer reach was dangerous in one way or another. It was not that they were arrogant, although they were, in the way that a mountain is arrogant, not through choice but through simple, unavoidable fact of scale. It was that they were wrong, and they were wrong in a way that everyone around them seemed to have quietly agreed to accept, and Calyx had always had trouble with that particular species of wrongness. The Volkai believed that capacity for violence was the correct measure of a species' worth, not intelligence, not creativity. Not the specific stubborn madness that makes one species look at a problem that has killed 17 other species and think, but what if we tried it again slightly differently? Violence. Force applied at the correct moment in the correct quantity. By this metric, they were correct that humans ranked low. Humans were soft-bodied, comparatively slow, without natural armor or venom or enhanced sensory apparatus. The Volcae had beaten humans in 3 of the 4 formal coalition combat assessments conducted in the last decade, and they had been very courteous about mentioning this whenever the topic arose, which in their presence was often, since they had a habit of bringing it up themselves. Calyx was aware of all of this. He was also aware that awareness does not do very much for you when a 2.5-meter apex predator with compound eyes is standing 4 feet away from you explaining, in careful and measured tones, that your species' biological limitations make you statistically unsuitable for frontline deployment. This is what happened on day 12. He was in the equipment bay, running the standard morning inventory on his kit, when Volcae sublegate Crethon found him. Crethon was the largest of the 6, marginally, but in the way that matters, and it had been watching Calyx since orientation with the focused interest of something that has classified an object and is still uncertain which category it belongs in. "You," Crethon said. The Volcae communicated through a combination of subsonic resonance and high-frequency clicking that the translation units rendered into something like the sound of a very confident door closing. "Human Calyx, you are registered for tomorrow's combat assessment." "I am," Calyx said, not looking up from his kit bag. "You will be paired against Sublegate Morven in the physical discipline bracket." Calyx looked up then. Morven was the second largest Volcae in the unit, and Morven had put 2 Sarathi cadets in the medical bay during the first week's sparring sessions, not through malice, but through what the incident report had delicately described as force calibration errors. "Good to know," Calyx said. "We are informing you as a courtesy," Crethon said. "Several of the other cadets are placing wagers on the outcome. We considered it appropriate that you be aware of what is being wagered." "What is being wagered?" "Whether you will require medical treatment before or after you reach the floor." Calyx held Crethon's compound gaze for a long moment. The eyes were expressionless in the way that compound eyes always were, not blank, exactly, but distributed, seeing everything at once and therefore seeming to focus on nothing in particular. "I appreciate the courtesy," Calyx said. Crethon's dorsal spines shifted, the Volcae equivalent of a shrug, which the translation notes in the cultural briefing had described as indicating completion of a transaction. "We will be watching," it said, and left. Calyx went back to his inventory. Then he stopped, put down the thermal blanket he'd been refolding, and sat on the bench for a moment with his hands on his knees. He had not joined the Coalition's combined arms program because he thought humans were apex predators. He knew what humans were. He'd grown up in the outer settlements, where knowing what you were was the difference between getting home and not getting home. Humans were soft and fragile and clever and mean, and absolutely unwilling to accept the definition that other species assigned to them. He had seen his father survive 3 winters in conditions that had killed Sarathi colonists, who had 17-point bone density advantages and internal heat regulation. He had watched his mother talk 3 heavily armed pirates into leaving their cargo intact by finding the exact specific thing each pirate was afraid of and naming it quietly and without drama, and he had been 11 years old and he had understood even then that what he was watching was not a miracle. It was a skill. It was a human skill. He thought about that for a moment. Then he took the pen out of his breast pocket, turned it over in his fingers once, put it back and went to bed. The combat assessment arena on KL-9 was a rounded chamber 40 meters in diameter, with observation galleries arranged in 3 ascending tiers around the circumference. It smelled like scorched polymer and something organic that Calyx had learned not to try to identify. The floor was rubberized composite over impact-absorbing foam, and the walls were reinforced transparent aluminum, so that cadets in the galleries could observe without being in the impact zone, which was a precaution that had apparently been introduced after an incident in the program's 3rd year that the senior instructors declined to discuss in detail. There were perhaps 200 cadets in the galleries when Calyx walked onto the floor. He recognized the distribution immediately. The cadets from species that had classified humans as non-threats were in the upper tier, watching with the mildly interested attention you gave to something unexpected. The Volcae were in the front row of the middle tier, spines neutral, which in Volcae posture language indicated they had already decided how this ended and were simply observing for confirmation. And in the lower tier, as close to the floor as observation rules allowed, were the 3 Terathi cadets and the 2 Pelani cadets, and a small young Sarathi named Sakith, who had been Calyx's sparring partner for the last week, and who was currently making a gesture with her bone spurs that, in Sarathi body language, meant something between good luck and I'm sorry about what's going to happen next. Calyx nodded to Sakith. Morven entered from the opposite side of the floor. It was not that Morven was trying to be intimidating. The thing about the Volcae was that intimidation was a byproduct, not an intention. Morven simply moved in the way that things move when they have been shaped over millions of years to be the last thing standing in any given environment. Low, fluid, enormously economical with weight, the way a very large wave is economical with water. Its combat chitin had been oiled, and it caught the light along the dorsal plates in pulses as Morven walked, and the compound eyes swept the floor in that slow, rotating way, cataloging, categorizing, assigning. The assessment moderator was a coalition instructor named Vila, a 4-armed Pelani with 20 years of combined arms experience, who had watched 400 human cadets come through KL9 and had never once seen one score in the top bracket against Volcae opposition. She ran through the assessment rules without inflection. Physical discipline bracket, no weapon discharge, 3-minute rounds. Cadet declared successful on either a judge-determined technical halt or completion of the full round without incapacitation. She did not say anything about winning. The assessment rubric did not use the word winning. It used completion criteria, which was the coalition's polite way of not having to explain to humans next of kin that their cadet had lost. Morven took its starting position. 7 feet of chitin-plated predator, dorsal spines fanned slightly in what Calyx now recognized as casual readiness. The threat display of something that is not threatened, but finds it efficient to clarify the relationship early. Calyx took his starting position. 5 feet 11 inches of soft-bodied omnivore, hands loose at his sides, weight distributed the way instructor Vila had drilled into him over 11 days of KL9 mornings. Vila sounded the start tone. Morven moved. The first thing Calyx understood about the Volcae in actual combat, as opposed to observing them in the mess hall or the briefing room, was that the threat display was honest advertising. They were not fast in the way that small things are fast, sudden, jerky, unpredictable. They were fast in the way that very large things are fast when they have been doing this for a very long time. Smooth, direct, committed. Morven covered the distance between them in a little under a second, lead arm sweeping in a horizontal arc that would have lifted Calyx completely off the ground if it had connected at full extension. It did not connect at full extension. Calyx had been watching Morven's shoulders. 12 days of watching Volcae move had taught him that the shoulder rotation preceded the arm sweep by approximately 1/3 of a second, not long, but long enough if you were already stepping. He stepped inside the arc, left, forward, close enough to smell the oil on the combat chitin, and the arm passed over his right shoulder with 1/2 inch of clearance and enough displaced air to push his hair flat. He was inside Morven's optimal range, which was not a safe place to be, but was the only place that reduced the Volcae's mechanical advantage. Up close, the size differential mattered less. Not zero, the weight differential alone was still substantial, but less. The problem was that being inside Morven's range did not give Calyx any range of his own that mattered. He could hit Morven. He had established that clearly enough in his head. The question was whether hitting Morven accomplished anything. The chitin would absorb direct impact. The joints were flexed and guarded by overlapping plate. The dorsal spines were currently fanned, which meant they were not being used offensively, but that could change in approximately the time it took Morven to decide to change it. Calyx had approximately 1 second inside the arc before Morven reset. He used it. He did not hit the chitin. He found the medial joint on the left arm, the gap between two plates where the Volkai's equivalent of an elbow connected, and he put his thumb into it with everything he had. Morven made a sound that the translation unit rendered as nothing at all, because it was outside the range that the unit was calibrated to interpret. What it was, Calyx had been told by the Sarathi xenobiology briefing 3 days earlier, was the Volkai vocalization for acute joint pain, a sound they rarely made because they rarely experienced it. Morven reset anyway, because of course it did, and the next sweep caught Calyx across the left side of his torso and sent him 4 feet sideways and into the wall. He hit the transparent aluminum and felt 2 ribs flex in a way that would require discussion with the medical bay, and he was back on his feet in the time it took Morven to close the distance again. 60 seconds into the round. The galleries were quiet in a way that was different from before. Before, the quiet had been the quiet of low expectations. Now it was something else, not quite the same silence, shifted by a few degrees in a direction Calyx could feel but not name. He lasted the full 3 minutes. He did not win. The assessment rubric didn't use that word, and it turned out this was accurate in his case. Morven put him on the floor twice more, and the second time the moderator briefly moved toward the technical halt signal before Calyx stood up again, and the moderator stepped back. He was bleeding from a split above his left eyebrow where one of Morven's secondary arm spurs had caught him, and his left side was going to be spectacular colors by morning. But he completed the round. Instructor Vila sounded the completion tone. The galleries were not quiet anymore. It was not applause exactly. It was something more complicated than applause. A sound compounded from 37 species, various responses to something they had not expected to see. And the compound effect was that the air in the arena felt different in the way that air feels different when something has shifted in the underlying logic of a room, and everyone present is processing the shift simultaneously. Calyx stood in the middle of the floor and breathed. Morven was across the arena, resetting its dorsal spines to neutral. Its compound eyes swept to Calyx once, and then it left the floor without comment, which in Volkai etiquette was a more significant gesture than anything it might have said. Sokoth was waiting for him outside the assessment bay. The young Sarathi was making a gesture with her bone spurs that Calyx now recognized. She'd made it once before, after a particularly difficult xenobiology exam, when she'd scored high enough to surprise herself. "Your cheekbone," she said, indicating the cut. "I know," he said. "The medial joint technique," she said. "Where did you learn Volkai joint mapping?" "Your species xenobiology briefing," he said. 3 days ago, it had a diagram." Sokoth looked at him for a moment. "You read the xenobiology briefing?" "I read all the briefings. In 11 days. I read fast." She made the bone spur gesture again, the one that meant something between surprised approval and mild exasperation. "You are a very strange human," she said. "Thanks," he said, and went to find the medical bay. The situation changed when the Volkai made a formal complaint. This was 6 days later, and Calyx had scored in the top bracket in 2 more assessment categories, tactical navigation and equipment deployment, which had moved him from the human-adjacent observation tier of the program rankings into actual ranked contention, which was an outcome that Sublegate Crethon described in a formal complaint to the program administrators as statistically irregular and inconsistent with established species performance profiles. The complaint was reviewed by Senior Administrator Vorath, a Galactic Coalition career official of 23 years standing who had the particular expression of someone who has spent 2 decades managing the expectations of 37 different species and has achieved a state of profound equanimity about all of them. Vorath reviewed Calyx's assessment scores, cross-referenced them against the Volkai's formal complaint, and called Calyx into his office for what the scheduling system listed as an administrative review. The office was small and efficient, the way that things were small and efficient in the outer reach where space was an actual commodity. Vorath sat on one side of a desk that was bolted to the wall, and Calyx sat on the other. Sublegate Crethon's complaint, Vorath said, uses the phrase unfair biological adaptation 4 times. I read the complaint, Calyx said. Vorath looked at him. Of course you did. A pause. The Volkai's concern is that your performance in the assessments may be attributable to what they describe as deceptive physiological characteristics not apparent at initial classification. They have requested a biological reassessment. A biological reassessment, Calyx said, to confirm that you are, in fact, a standard template human and not a biologically augmented variant. Calyx looked at his hands for a moment. They were exactly what they had always been, the hands of a Belt Territory surveyor's son, marked with the particular calluses that came from handling equipment in cold weather for most of his childhood. No augmentations, no enhancements, just hands. I'm a standard human, he said. I know, Vorath said. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone who is deciding how much honesty the situation warrants. The Volkai are not accustomed to being outperformed in categories they have designated as physical or tactical. Their formal complaint is about the assessment process, but the underlying concern is different. He set down the complaint document. You have disrupted their model. Their model, Calyx said. The model that explains their position in the program rankings. The model that explains their position relative to human cadets specifically. In 11 assessments over 17 days, their model has been incorrect about you 3 times. For the Volkai, incorrect models require either revision or the removal of the anomalous data point. Calyx understood this. He had understood it from the first morning in the mess hall, when he had watched Crethon move through the room with the confidence of something whose model of the world had never needed updating. The Volkai were not wrong about most things. Their model of themselves was accurate. Their model of the Sarathi was accurate. Their model of 23 other species in the program was accurate. Their model of humans was based on 40 years of comparative data, and it had been correct for 40 years. It had just stopped being correct. What happens to the complaint? Calyx asked. It will be reviewed and found to have insufficient procedural grounds and dismissed, Vorath said. You will remain in the program. Your assessments will stand. He paused. What will also happen is that the Volkai will recalibrate. They are thorough. When their model is wrong, they find out why and they update it. Sublegate Crethon has requested access to your full assessment records in order to identify the specific techniques and adaptive behaviors that produced your results. They want to know how I did it, Calyx said, so they can account for it in the future. Calyx was quiet for a moment, and when they account for it. Vorath looked at him steadily. That, he said, is the question the program's medical staff has been asking me to raise with you. He set a second document on the desk. The next assessment bracket is the high-hazard environmental adaptation sequence. You will be sharing a combat training group with the Volkai cohort. The program medical staff has expressed concern about the level of contact that may occur. Calyx read the document. It was a medical risk assessment, and it was thorough in the way that things are thorough when the people who wrote them are genuinely worried. It used phrases like force differential and involuntary contact during group exercises, and recommended monitoring protocols. And underneath all of these phrases was a simpler phrase that no one had written down but that Calyx could read clearly enough. "We are not sure we can keep you safe." He set the document down. "I'll sign the risk acknowledgement," he said. Voreth looked at him for a long moment. The Volokai's performance in the high-hazard sequence over the last 8 cohorts has been exceptional. No other species has outperformed them in that bracket. The physical demands of the sequence are significant. "I'll need access to the environmental specs," Calyx said, "and the assessment rubric, and the Volokai's historical performance data." A pause. "Why?" "Because if I'm going to outperform them," Calyx said, "I need to know what they did." Voreth was quiet for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not quite what a human would call a smile, since Voreth was Pelani and Pelani expressed warmth through a specific dilation of the secondary eyelids rather than any change in the mouth, but something in the same neighborhood. "I'll have the files sent to your quarters," he said. What happened in the high-hazard environmental sequence was not what Calyx had expected, which meant it was also not what the Volokai had accounted for. The sequence was designed to simulate outer reach combat conditions, unstable terrain, variable gravity, partial atmosphere, limited visibility, and multiple simultaneous threat vectors. The last part was the important one. The Volokai were extraordinary in their performance against a single high-priority threat. Their threat assessment hierarchy was efficient, aggressive, and optimized over evolutionary time for exactly the kind of confrontation where the objective was to destroy one very dangerous thing before it destroyed you. The sequence put cadets against 8 threat vectors simultaneously. What the Volokai's historical performance data showed, when Calyx read it carefully enough, was that they were very good against 8 threats and very consistent against 8 threats, and had scored in the high bracket against 8 threats in every iteration of the sequence going back 6 years. What the data also showed, in a column that appeared to be tracking something else and had been labeled collateral event frequency, was that the Volokai's response to 8 simultaneous threats tended to be what the assessment rubric called sequential primary neutralization, which was the program's language for. They killed the most dangerous thing first, and then the next most dangerous thing, and so on, very efficiently, until there were no dangerous things left. The collateral event frequency column tracked how often, in the process of this sequential neutralization, something that was not a threat got damaged. The number in that column was higher than Calyx had expected. He read the rubric again. He read the assessment objectives again. He read the scenario parameters again, and then he read the thing that the environmental specs described as an incidental element, and that was listed in a footnote because the program designers apparently considered it minor. In addition to the 8 threat vectors, each combat scenario contained 1 non-threat element, a resource cache, a wounded allied unit marker, a piece of critical equipment, that cadets were expected to protect in addition to neutralizing threats. The Volokai's scores in that footnoted sub-objective were lower than their scores in every other category. Not low. The Volokai were not low at anything, but lower, consistently, in every iteration, because a non-threat, by definition, did not require neutralization, and the Volokai's model of the sequence was built around neutralization, and so the non-threat had a way of becoming collateral. Calyx thought about his father's surveying team, working in the Belt Territory winter, how you moved when you were responsible for something that couldn't protect itself, how the math changed when your objective was not just surviving, but making sure something else survived too. He ran the sequence. He did not score in the high bracket in neutralization efficiency. The Volokai outperformed him by a significant margin on that sub-metric. They were faster, they were more decisive, they managed force application with a precision that was, genuinely, beautiful in the way that any very refined capability was beautiful. But the non-threat element in Calyx's scenario run was intact at the end of the sequence. every non-threat element, all three sub-objectives. The Volokai's run, by the historical average, would have had a 40% damage rate on non-threat elements. Calyx's was 0. The assessment moderators held a brief discussion. The rubric was consulted. The sub-objective column was examined. And Calyx, who had finished the sequence and was sitting against the wall of the staging area, eating a nutrition block and watching the moderators talk, watched the conversation move from brief to extended to something that had the quality of a disagreement between people who had been assuming the rubric meant one thing, and were now confronting the possibility that it meant something else. The Volokai cohort finished their run. Their neutralization scores were, as expected, outstanding. Sublegate Crethon moved past Calyx toward the data terminal, dorsal spines in the high authority position, and stopped. "Your protective sub-objective scores," Crethon said, "not a question." "They're in the report," Calyx said. "You prioritize the non-threat element. The rubric says to protect it." "The rubric says neutralization of threat vectors is primary," Crethon said. "Protection of non-threat elements is secondary." "The rubric says both," Calyx said. "It doesn't say ignore one." Crethon's dorsal spines shifted through two positions that Calyx had not encountered before and did not have a cultural briefing reference for. "The non-threat element cannot threaten you. Priority should route to what threatens you." "Priority should route to what the mission requires," Calyx said. "Sometimes those are the same thing, sometimes they're not." Another long pause. The compound eyes moved through their slow rotation. "You read the historical performance data," Crethon said. "Not an accusation, something more like a recognition." "I read everything," Calyx said. Crethon was still for a moment. Then the dorsal spines settled into neutral, the same position as after the combat assessment, the position that meant completion of a transaction. "You will require medical review before tomorrow's sessions," Crethon said. "You sustained 2 lacerations during the sequence." It turned and moved toward the data terminal. Calyx looked at his forearm, where he had not noticed until this moment that he was bleeding. He had been bleeding for most of the sequence, and had apparently not noticed because he had been busy. He ate the rest of his nutrition block. There was a period after the high-hazard sequence results were posted that Calyx thought of later as the recalibration period. It lasted 9 days, and during those 9 days the Volokai cohort went very quiet in a specific way, not the quiet of dismissal, which was the quiet he had been living with for the first 2 weeks on KL9, but the quiet of something paying close attention. He noticed it first in the mess hall, on the morning after the assessment scores went up. He arrived at the usual time, took the usual reconstituted protein bar from the usual dispenser, sat at the usual end of the long table. The Volokai cohort was already there, distributed across the upper section of the table, and when he sat down, 3 of the 6 turned to look at him in the same moment. The compound eyes completing their slow rotation and pausing when they reached him, which was a thing he had not seen them do with any other cadet. He ate his protein bar and pretended not to notice, because noticing would have changed what they were doing, and he found what they were doing interesting. They were, he eventually concluded, watching him eat. Not in a predatory sense, the threat display spines were neutral on all 6 of them, but in the way that you watch something when you are collecting data on it. He ate slowly. He thought about the protein bar. He thought about the fact that he was the only cadet in the program who ate this specific type of protein bar, because it was one of 3 food dispenser options that provided the specific amino acid profile that his body needed for muscle recovery in lower gravity environments, and he had read the nutritional briefing on day 1. After 12 minutes, Sublegate Crethon came and sat at the other end of his table. This had never happened before. In 31 days of mess hall mornings, the Volokai had occupied their section, and Calyx had occupied his, and the space between them had been the natural space that forms between things that do not have occasion to approach each other. Crethon now occupied the far end of Calyx's table with the deliberate quality of something that has made a decision and is following through. Calyx waited. "Your protective subobjective scores," Crethon said, which was what it had said before in the staging area. "Still in the report," Calyx said. "We have reviewed the report." "I figured you would." Crethon's dorsal spines shifted through one of the positions Calyx hadn't catalogued yet, a middle position between the high authority deployment and the neutral reset that he'd been seeing more frequently over the last few days. He added it to his running observation log. "Your approach in the sequence was to identify the assessment objective's full scope before committing to a primary action strategy." "That's one way to describe it," Calyx said. "The Volkai approach is to identify the primary threat and neutralize it. Secondary objectives are addressed after primary neutralization is confirmed." Crethon's eyes made their slow rotation. "Your approach addresses all objectives simultaneously. This produces lower neutralization efficiency." "It produces intact non-threat elements," Calyx said. "At cost to primary performance metrics." "At cost to one set of performance metrics, at gain in a different set." Calyx finished the protein bar and folded the wrapper. "The question is which set of metrics the actual mission requires." A long silence. Calyx had noticed that the Volkai's conversational pauses were not awkward, they were deliberate, and they lasted exactly as long as whatever was being processed required. He had started timing them. This one was 12 seconds. "You assume that all objective elements are equally weighted," Crethon said. "I assume that the mission defines the weights, not the training sequence," Calyx said. "In the assessment, the rubric weighted them equally. In an actual mission, you'd need to know what the actual stakes were." He paused. "I'd read the briefing." 14 seconds. "You read all briefings," Crethon said. "All of them," Calyx said, "and the footnotes." Crethon was still. "The Volkai training methodology does not include footnote review as a formal practice." "I know," Calyx said. "I read your training methodology documentation." The longest pause yet, 22 seconds. Calyx timed it exactly. "That documentation is internal to the Volkai cohort," Crethon said. "It was filed with the program administration as part of the cohort's orientation intake," Calyx said. "The program administration's filing system is accessible to all enrolled cadets. It's in the access protocol briefing." He picked up the wrapper to put in the recycler. "I read the access protocol briefing." Crethon's dorsal spines did something that Calyx had never seen before and that no cultural briefing had covered. They spread fully, held for approximately 2 seconds, and then closed again completely. He filed this under unknown register, possibly requiring new category. "You are," Crethon said carefully, "a different kind of problem than we initially categorized you as." "Different kind of problem or different kind of resource," Calyx said. 8 seconds. "The distinction may be contextual," Crethon said, and picked up its food tray and returned to the Volkai section. Calyx sat with the empty protein bar wrapper for a moment and thought about that. Then he went to the filing system and read 3 more intake documents he hadn't gotten to yet. Socketh found him in the library alcove off the main corridor, a small, climate-controlled space with 4 study terminals that no one used very much because the program moved fast enough that cadets generally didn't have surplus time for supplementary reading. Socketh had been finding him there periodically since the first week, initially because she had a question about a tactical navigation problem, and he had happened to be there, and subsequently because they had both discovered that the other was more useful to think out loud at than to think silently at, which was a rarer quality than either of them had expected to find in a training cohort made up of 37 species. The subobjective scoring is being discussed in the performance review meeting, she said, settling into the terminal across from him. Her bone spurs were in the extended but relaxed position, which in the Sarathi behavioral briefing was listed as indicating comfortable intellectual engagement. He had started to feel that he could read Saketh fairly well. The senior instructors are arguing about rubric interpretation. I know, he said. I read the meeting agenda. It was posted this morning. She made the bone spur gesture he had come to associate with exasperated approval. You read the meeting agenda. The administrative calendar is available through the same filing access as the intake documents, he said. Once you know it's there. Calyx, she said, are you aware that in my species' educational tradition the correct term for what you do is Threnvash? When he looked blank, it translates imprecisely. The closest human concept is probably something like the one who reads the signs that others walk past. It is considered a navigational gift. Specifically, it's the quality that good scouts have. She tilted her head. We value it highly. What does the Vorkai tradition call it? He asked. I don't know, she said. I don't think they have a term for it. I don't think they've needed one before. He thought about this. What do humans call it? Saketh considered. From what I've observed, most other species assume humans simply call it being prepared. That's roughly it, Calyx said. Is it just being prepared? He thought about his father's survey team, about the specific difference between the surveyors who came back from the Belt Territory winter and the ones who didn't. It had not been the ones with the best equipment or the highest cold weather ratings. It had been the ones who had read the seasonal terrain data for the previous 8 years and had noticed the pattern that said, in year 9, the ice shelf shifts. The ones who knew where to look because they had paid attention to where to look, and had developed the habit of paying attention before there was any obvious reason to. Being prepared is the visible part, he said. The part underneath it is just paying attention to everything, not deciding in advance what matters and what doesn't, not having a model that tells you which information is important and which isn't, because sometimes the footnote is the whole story. Saketh was quiet for a moment, bone spurs in their full extension. That is very different from how the Vorkai operate, she said. The Vorkai are extraordinary, Calyx said. Their model is right about almost everything. They've built it over 30 years of systematic training and evolutionary selection pressure, and it works. The problem is when it encounters something that doesn't fit the model. You, Saketh said. Humans, he said, not just me. We're a species that builds models badly, which turns out to mean we build them lightly. We hold them loosely. We're used to being wrong about things because we're wrong about things all the time, and so when something doesn't fit, we update faster. Not because we're smarter. The Vorkai are smarter than us in all the ways that matter most in direct competition. But we've had to get good at being wrong. We've had practice. Saketh looked at him for a long time. Outside the library alcove, the corridor sounds of a training station continued, cadets moving between sessions, equipment being prepped, the ambient low hum of life support that you stopped hearing after the first week, but that was always there. The subobjective scoring meeting, she said finally, is going to conclude with a rubric clarification that weights non-threat element protection at 20% of total assessment score, rather than the current footnote categorization. I know, Calyx said. I saw the preliminary recommendation in the draft agenda. You read the draft agenda. It was posted in the secondary administrative folder. She made the exasperated approval gesture and opened her own study materials. They worked in companionable silence for a while, which was another thing Calyx had found rarer than he'd expected. The ability to share a quiet room with someone from a completely different species and have the silence be the good kind. After 20 minutes, she said, without looking up from her terminal, "You know they're going to send you somewhere difficult." "I know," he said. "The Vorkai complaint drew attention to your file. Performance files that attract that kind of attention get reviewed by Fleet Command. She paused. The kinds of assignments that come from Fleet Command reviews of unusual performance profiles are not comfortable ones. I know that too, he said. And he thought about the outer reach, and the cold light from the observation window, and the specific quality of a challenge that has been refusing to be comfortable for as long as you can remember, and has thereby become the condition under which you've learned everything you know. I've been reading the outer reach deployment records, he said. The assignments that come from unusual profile reviews. I wanted to know what the likely parameters were. She looked up at him. Of course you have. The prep is going to take about 2 weeks, he said. If I start tomorrow. You've already started, she said. Yesterday, he agreed, and went back to his reading. What happened next came without warning, because the things that change the shape of your life almost never announce themselves. He had been on KL-9 for 31 days when the transmission came in from the outer assessment team. He was in the equipment bay again, the same bench, the same inventory, the same reconstituted protein bar from the same automated dispenser, and his comm unit buzzed with a priority flag, and when he opened it the message was from Instructor Vila and it said, "Report to Assessment Bay C immediately." Assessment Bay C was larger than the standard combat bay. It had a full observation gallery and a higher ceiling to accommodate what the room specs listed as large-form combat scenarios. And when Calyx arrived it already contained 6 Volkai cadets, both Pelani assessment moderators, Senior Administrator Voreth, and one other individual who Calyx had not seen before. She was Sarathi, but older than Saketh, older than most of the Sarathi cadets Calyx had worked with, and she wore a uniform that was not the program standard issue, but was instead the dark blue of Coalition Fleet Command, with insignia on the shoulder that Calyx recognized from the fleet rank taxonomy briefing as the equivalent of what a human military would call a colonel. Her name, Voreth said, was Field Commander Arith Vish. She was here for what Voreth described as an extended assessment scenario. And she was here because the Coalition's combined arm assignments for the outer reach were being evaluated, and there was a specific assignment under evaluation that required specific capabilities, and the assignment computer had flagged 3 cadets from the current KL-9 cohort as candidates for preliminary evaluation. 2 of the 3 cadets were Volkai. The third was Calyx. Field Commander Vish looked at the 3 of them with the calm of someone who has evaluated a lot of people and no longer finds it interesting unless she finds it surprising. Her bone spurs were fully retracted, which the Sarathi cultural briefing noted as indicating either relaxed confidence or high focus, depending on context. Extended assessment scenario, she said. The objective is a retrieval operation under active hostile presence. The assets to be retrieved are 3 data cores from a compromised research station. The hostile presence is a Volkai Apex combat unit. She paused to let that settle. A Volkai Apex combat unit was not the same thing as a Volkai combat cadet. A Volkai Apex combat unit was what happened when you took the species that had evolved as the dominant predator across its entire biome, and then spent 30 years training the most capable members of that species for the specific application of structured violence. They were not opponents. They were, according to the Coalition's own threat assessment documentation, an environmental condition. Calyx had read the documentation. The 2 Volkai candidates, Vish said, will operate as a team in the first run. Cadet Marin will operate alone in the second run. This is not a comparative evaluation. The parameters are different and the outcomes will be assessed independently. The objective is capability profiling, not competition. Sublegate Crethon's dorsal spines moved. The human cadet will operate alone against an Apex combat unit. The human cadet's assessment file suggests certain capability profiles that don't conform to standard human classification, Vish said. The extended scenario is designed to characterize those profiles under higher demand conditions. Her secondary eyelids moved in the Sarathi equivalent of a brisk period at the end of a sentence. Any further questions? There were no further questions. The Volkai team went first. Calyx watched on the secondary monitor in the staging area. The scenario was designed to be observed for training purposes, so the observation feed was standard protocol. The two Volkai cadets moved through the compromised research station scenario with the fluid, committed efficiency that characterized everything they did. The Apex combat unit that the scenario parameters called hostile presence was, as advertised, an environmental condition. It was larger than either of the two cadets, faster than anything that size had a right to be, and it was not a training sim. It was a live Volkai Apex unit, which the Coalition used for exactly these assessments, because nothing else could adequately simulate one. The two cadets neutralized 2 of the 3 threats present, and retrieved 2 of the 3 data cores before the Apex unit ended the scenario. It was, by all objective metrics, an impressive result. Calyx went to the staging area, checked his equipment, and took the pen out of his breast pocket. He turned it over in his fingers once. He had been thinking about this since the briefing, about the Volkai Apex unit, and about what an Apex combat unit's model of a threat looked like. It would have been trained for 30 years against the full range of Coalition species. It would know what Volkai cadets looked like in a combat scenario, what Sarathi looked like, what Pelani looked like. It would have 30 years of data on every significant physical combat profile in the outer reach. It would have, at most, the historical performance data on humans that Crethon had used, the data from 40 years ago, before the assessments that had prompted the formal complaint, the data from when the model was still correct. Calyx entered the scenario. The research station set was 30 meters of corridors and equipment bays arranged around a central hub, with the 3 data cores distributed across the outer ring. The lighting was emergency mode red, and the atmosphere simulation was partial, breathable but thin, which meant cardiovascular efficiency mattered more than it usually did. The floor was the rubberized composite of the assessment bays, scored with the marks of previous runs. He did not go for the data cores first. He went for the Apex unit. This was not the efficient choice by any prior tactical framework anyone had given him. You did not walk toward the Volkai Apex combat unit. You worked around it, created distance, minimized contact, retrieved your objectives, and got out. This was what the two cadets had done. This was what the training manual said. Calyx walked toward the Apex unit because the Apex unit was going to find him anyway. And on the Apex unit's terms, the outcome of that finding was not uncertain. The only way to change the terms was to change when and where the finding happened, which meant making a choice about the time and location rather than having the choice made for him. He found it in the central hub. It was larger than Crethon, which he had known from the specs, but which was different to understand as a number versus to understand as a fact standing 7 feet in front of you in a corridor lit red. Its dorsal spines were fully deployed. Its compound eyes tracked to him immediately, completing their cataloging sweep in approximately a half second, and he watched the dorsal spines do something he had not seen before. They stilled completely, going from the active threat display configuration into a fixed position that his Volkai behavioral briefing had listed under a section heading called Confirmation of Category. It had classified him, human, non-threatening category, assigning to management Q. He had 3 seconds. He thought about his father's marking habit, and about what it meant to pay close attention to something that other people had stopped paying attention to. He thought about the medial joint on Morven's arm, and about the fact that the medial joint existed on every Volkai. It was structural, not individual. He thought about 30 years of training and what 30 years of training did to your model of what a threat looked like. He thought about the pen in his breast pocket. He stepped forward. The pen was a surveyor's field pen, hardened polymer barrel, tungsten alley nib, designed to write in conditions that would destroy standard instruments. His father had given it to him the day he left for Kale 9. It was not a weapon. It had never been designed as a weapon. The medial joint on the apex unit's leading arm was in the same location as the medial joint on every other Volkai he had studied. Same gap between the plates. Same nerve cluster behind the joint, mapped in the xenobiology briefing from survey data rather than combat application, because no one had apparently considered it in a combat context. The difference between the apex unit and Morven, Calyx had noticed from the training records, was 30 years of drilling the same refined motion sets against opponents who knew to expect them. The apex unit's threat model was comprehensive and well-trained, and utterly calibrated to what things it had trained against looked like. It was not calibrated to a human who walked directly toward it. He drove the pen into the medial joint. The sound the apex unit made was the same sound Morven had made in the assessment bay, outside translation range, a vocalization for something it had not expected to feel. It was a short sound, but what mattered was the half-second it created in the apex unit's sequential response system. Half a second where the model was being updated in real time, where 30 years of training was being rapidly consulted and finding no reference case for this specific input. Calyx was already moving. He was not going to beat the apex unit in a combat exchange. He had understood this from the beginning, and it had never been the plan. The plan was the half-second, and what you did with a half-second when you had already thought about it very carefully. He had already mapped the research station from the schematic. He knew where the 3 data cores were. He knew that the most efficient retrieval path required passing through the central hub once, which meant he had one pass at the hub with the apex unit occupying it. One pass that he needed to be fast enough to complete before the apex unit finished updating its model and the half-second ended. He went through the hub at a dead run. The apex unit responded at the edge of the half-second. He felt the displaced air of a sweep that came within inches of his back as he cleared the hub threshold. And then he was in the outer ring corridor, and the apex unit was behind him and recalibrating. He retrieved the first core. He retrieved the second core. He was at the third core when the apex unit found him again. It had updated its model. He could see it in the way it was moving, no longer the dismissive smoothness of something dealing with a management queue item, but the tight, focused efficiency of something that has reclassified a target. It knew now what he could do. It had incorporated the pen. It had incorporated the speed. It had not incorporated the fact that he had read its performance data and knew that it was slightly slower on left lateral pivots due to an old joint stress from a previous assessment, because that was in a medical footnote that was probably only readable if you were going through the records looking for exactly that kind of thing. He went left. He got the third core. He made the extraction point with 2 data cores secured in his arms and the third tucked under his chin, bleeding again from somewhere on his right forearm, and breathing in a way that was going to require some time and a sit-down, and the scenario concluded. Field Commander Vish was at the data terminal when he came out of the staging area. She was looking at the output with the expression that Sarathi wore when something had surprised them. Secondary eyelids very slightly forward, bone spurs involuntarily starting to extend before being consciously reset. 3 data cores, she said. Yes, he said. The hostile unit was a full Apex combat veteran, 412 assessment scenarios over 30 years. I read the record, he said. He sat down. His legs were slightly interested in stopping. The pen, she said. It's a surveyor's pen, he said. Tungsten nib, Fits the medial joint gap to within a millimeter. He took it out of his breast pocket and set it on the bench. It had a small amount of HFY joint fluid on the nib, and he felt mildly bad about that. I'll clean it before I give it back. Vish looked at the pen for a long moment. Then she looked at Calyx. Then she looked at the assessment output again. You walked toward an apex unit, she said. It was going to find me anyway, he said. I wanted to choose the terms. Another silence. The Volkai candidates are being considered for a forward assignment in the Pelax sector. High hazard, close contact, continuous hostile presence environment. I know, Calyx said. Vish looked at him. How? The Pelax sector assignment brief was in the Public Ops Board 3 days ago. The parameters matched what I'd expect for a high-hazard candidate evaluation. I read it when it went up. A very long silence. You, said Field Commander Vish, very carefully, are either the most prepared cadet this program has produced in a decade, or you are something I don't have a classification for. I'm a standard human, Calyx said. Yes, she said slowly. I'm beginning to understand what that means. She was quiet for another moment, in the way of someone who is making a decision that they have actually already made, and are now simply completing the process of acknowledging it. The Pelax assignment has 3 slots, she said. The Volkai candidates will take 2. She picked up the pen from the bench and turned it over in her fingers, the way Calyx had always done, and then she set it down again. I need the capability profile for the 3rd slot to be something different, something that can do what they cannot and do it reliably. She looked at him. The Pelax environment is continuous hostile presence, Volkai apex units, active. The assignment duration is 90 days. I'll need the environmental specs, Calyx said, and the historical presence data, and the facility schematics. Of course you will, she said. And there it was again, the Sarathi warmth register, secondary eyelids forward, the involuntary bone spur extension that she didn't entirely reset this time. Can I ask something? Calyx said. Go ahead. The Volkai complaint, he said. Crethon filed it on the grounds of statistical irregularity. I read it. You read it, Vish said. Of course. There's a section where Crethon notes that the anomalous performance data doesn't conform to established human profiles because it demonstrates behavioral adaptation inconsistent with the species' known cognitive limitations. He paused. I want to know if the Coalition's formal response is going to address that characterization. Vish was quiet for a moment. The Coalition's formal response, she said, will note that the species' performance profiles are based on historical data and that historical data is periodically revised when new evidence warrants revision. She looked at him steadily. In this case, the evidence is substantial. Good, Calyx said. He picked up the pen. He wiped the nib on the edge of his sleeve. He put it back in his breast pocket. Outside the assessment bay, Socketh was waiting. She had apparently been waiting for some time, because she was sitting on the floor of the corridor with her knees up, and her bone spurs in the distracted neutral position of someone who is thinking about something else. She stood up when she saw him, made the bone spur gesture that she'd made twice before. 3 cores, she said. 3 cores, he said. With a pen, she said. With a pen, he agreed. She looked at him for a moment with the wide secondary eyelid expression that he had come to understand was the Sarathi version of finding something delightful. Calyx, she said, I have been reviewing the xenobiology classification system for your species. And the classification entry for humans is very short, she said. It was written 40 years ago. I believe they are going to need to write a longer one. He thought about his father's pen and the marking habit and the surveys that got done because someone kept paying attention to things that other people had stopped paying attention to. He thought about 40 years of a model that had been correct and the specific day the model stopped being correct. They'll catch up, he said. Down the corridor, the lights of Assessment Bay C had come back to standard illumination from emergency mode red. Somewhere in the facility, the Volkai cohort was reviewing their performance data with the thoroughness he had come to expect from them. They would update their model. They would incorporate the new evidence. They would recalibrate. He was looking forward to what came next. He took the pen out one more time, made a small mark on the back of his left hand. A surveyor's habit, the way you dated a thing, the way you noted that this moment had occurred and been registered and would be accounted for, and he put it away. Kale 9 external observation window at the end of the corridor showed the outer reach in the way that it always looked at this hour. Dark and enormous and absolutely indifferent, scattered through with the cold light of stars that had been burning since before any species in the Combined Arms Program had developed the concept of a species. All of it, every bit of it, had been classified once as something humans couldn't handle. Calyx looked at it for a moment. Then he went to find the medical bay, because his forearm was still bleeding, and he had 90 days of preparation to start on, and there was no point delaying either one.